Hi, everyone. So for this week, we're going to be talking about indigeneity in Mexico. So here are the student learning outcomes for this week. You will be able to understand the politics of indigeneity in modern day Mexico. You will be able to reflect on modern day indigenous movements and their responses to neoliberal capitalism and colonialism. And you will discuss the complexities of modern day indigeneity. Right now, in order for us to understand this concept of indigeneity, I wanted to give you a brief definition about it. The term indigeneity has emerged to describe the state of being indigenous or related to indigenousness. As indigenous peoples, we recognize our indigeneity, our indigenousness, our identity. Indigenousness for many can relate to your territory, culture, community, and traditions. Now, that being said, to move a little bit forward to specifically to what we're talking about this week, a couple of questions. First one would be, when did capitalism begin? Now, a lot of people think that capitalism is something that happened in like the 1800s or the 1900s, but the reality of that is capitalism began when colonialism began. And for those of you who know the saying, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In the late 1400s, early 1500s, the Spanish would arrive in what is now known as Mexico. And there they would encounter an entire hemisphere worth of people. These are people that we know as indigenous peoples. Now, almost immediately, at least, the Spanish come into contact with one of the largest of the groups, which you know of as the Aztecs, right? Well, the word Aztec didn't really exist. Their actual name was the Mexica, which is where we actually get the name Mexico or Mexico from. Now, the thing that we have to consider here is that the Aztecs themselves were conquerors, right? They were kind of an empire in the way that we would understand it today. But you all know the way that this plays out. Eventually, the Spanish win, right? Largely because of disease. But from there, what we get the conflict of is one world versus another, one view versus another. And for many Mexicans, this still plays out in our identity, right? And so I want you to consider this question: what does it really mean to be Mexican? Do I have to speak Spanish? Do I have to be Catholic? Do I have to look a certain way? Or do I have to be from a certain place? Now, that being said, to move a little bit forward, I wanted to introduce the EZLN. The EZLN, or in Spanish, El Ejército Zapatista para la Liberación Nacional, is an indigenous movement from the southern state of Chiapas, right? For those of you who are familiar with Chiapas, it borders Guatemala. It is largely jungle and it's very mountainous. You can climb up a cerro, as we say in Spanish, right? A hillside, and it can drop like 15 degrees as you're climbing upwards, right? So the other thing that we have to consider about this area, so basically all of southern Mexico and most of Central America, is the people that lived in this area are ethnically Mayan, right? Like pyramid building, calendar making Mayans, like those people. And a lot of people think that they just kind of vanished when the Spanish arrived, right? Like the second the Spanish arrived, nope, no more Mayans, right? But if you take a look at the culture and the identity of the region, it is still very much indigenous and very much Mayan. Now, to move a little bit forward for that, in the documentary that you're going to watch, they will show a lot of this guy. This is Subcomandante Marcos, or Sub Commander Marcos. The thing that we have to realize about these indigenous people is that many of them don't speak Spanish. Most of them never bothered to learn Spanish because what for, right? That was quite literally the language of the invaders, right? And 500 years later, you have an entire communities that do not speak any European language. Now, Marcos is often seen as the translator for the movement. He is a sub commander. He isn't one of the top heads. He's just the mouthpiece, if you will. Now, who does lead it? Well, one of the main leaders who passed away several years ago of cancer, her name is Comandante Ramona, right? Comandante Ramona only spoke Spanish in a very, very broken way, right? Like very loose way. But she largely spoke her indigenous language. Now, scattered up and down Mexico, you still, and all the rest of Latin America, you have entire communities that have never bothered to learn English. I mean, excuse me, never bothered to learn Spanish. So the interesting thing is that when they arrive in the United States, a lot of these new immigrant children from places like Oaxaca or Guerrero or Chiapas, is a lot of these kids will be placed in English as a second language classes, so ESL classes, and they're being taught Spanish and English, right? Because the whole goal is to get them to learn English. But the thing is that these kids are starting from an indigenous language and they have to learn Spanish, and then from there they have to learn English. So really they're eventually going to be trilingual, right? Now, another indigenous language that is spoken in Mexico is Mazateco. This is a whistled language, so let's go ahead and take a look.
Ya. Nisme. Nasma. Niño.
El mazateco chiflado nace a través de la necesidad de comunicarnos a grandes distancias. Puede ser de un cerro a otro cerro, pero para chiflar distancias largas la persona tiene que usar otro chiflido, es como decir, es muy espontáneo para nosotros. Inclusive ahorita puedo hacer un chiflido hacia mi primo que se encuentra allá afuera, sin verme él me puede contestar. ¿Hacemos una prueba?
¿Y dónde aprendiste a hablar así?
Me enseñaron y de los pájaros.
Representa para mí el entender la relación con la naturaleza, el entender la convivencia mutua entre nosotros, los principios y los valores comunitarios que me han inculcado a través de la lengua mazateca. El sistema educativo nos mete en una dinámica de desplazar nuestra lengua, sobre todo en donde existen niños monolingües en mazateco, pues se da el proceso de castellanización. Mucha gente se veía discriminada porque también se les relacionaba mucho con el término indio. Siento que con la fuerza, que con el pensar de nuestros viejos nos están dando ese impulso de volver a renacer, de decir, no dejen que se pierda la lengua, no dejen que se pierdan los conocimientos.
¿El mazateco?
So as you may have been able to gather from that video, there is essentially a lot of cultural diversity in Mexico. From the outside, you don't really see that, especially Mexicans that are in the United States often have a very monolithic view of being Mexican. That to be Mexican is only one thing and one thing only. You have to like the same music, you have to speak Spanish, you have to be Catholic, etc., 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 right? But as you can see from the video, that indigenous peoples have been fighting back against this, I guess, colonization, even within Mexico. Now, just to introduce the Zapatistas a little, this is a quick clip from the documentary, A Place Called Chiapas.
Teresa tells me that when the gods created the Mayan Indians, they called them the people of corn, the true people. Then other people from another part of the world came and put the Mayans under their boot. But the Mayans said to themselves, ya basta, enough. We will take ourselves underground and we will wait for the moment to rise up, like corn. That moment came on New Year's Eve, 1993. In Mexico City, members of the ruling party were celebrating the new year. The Institutional Revolutionary Party had ruled Mexico for almost 70 years. The ruling party was celebrating its free trade agreement with Canada and the United States. It was to begin the following morning. The deal, they said, would launch Mexico into the First World. But this time, they had made a mistake. To make way for free trade and large farms growing export crops, the ruling party stopped distributing land to campesinos like Teresa. Now, campesinos had nothing left to lose. As Mexico City celebrated, 1,300 kilometers to the south in Chiapas, squads of indigenous guerrilla soldiers moved out of the mountains. The tourist city of San Cristobal de las Casas woke up to find an indigenous army in its streets. Some soldiers carried AK-47s. Others carried sticks. They had seized 650 ranches and now controlled a quarter of the state of Chiapas.
We were expecting that something would be happening, but we didn't know what. What do I do with 25 German tourists? What do I do with these tourists?
On the television news, one man appeared a foot taller than the rest. Unlike the indigenous guerrillas, he spoke Spanish. Subcomandante, or Sub-Commander Marcos, started translating for a revolution.
¿Me puedes explicar quiénes son y dónde van y cuál es la onda?
Bueno, lo que pasó es que el día de hoy se atacaron 4 cabeceras municipales, todas en el estado de Chiapas. Es un movimiento de insurrección de nuestra organización que se llama Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional.
Now, going back to, the whole point of this, really, this is indigenous people who have been struggling against really the same system since the very beginning, right? Since the 1400s. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with your trade agreements, the North American Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA, was an agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico that lasted from 1994 to 2020, right? To 2020. Now, the problem with this is that it largely benefited the United States, Canada, and the rich of Mexico, but not the poor of Mexico. And from here, one of the things that you have to understand is it because it largely favored mainly the United States and Mexico, it took away a lot of the rights of Mexican farmers, right? And specifically in regards to corn, and to another thing that you may have noticed recently, tequila, right? So before, tequila came from a very, very specific place in Mexico, right? There is a state called Jalisco in Mexico, and there's a region called Tequila, and that that is literally where tequila would come from. It wasn't real tequila unless it came out of this region. But now what we've seen because of NAFTA, one of the provisions was that Mexico would lose exclusive rights to tequila. So now what you have is a lot of American and foreign-made tequilas. You have people like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who has his own tequila brand now. Someone like Bryan Cranston and Aaron Paul have their own tequila brand, and even Kendall Jenner has her own tequila brand. And the thing that a lot of people are like, oh my God, how cute, how trendy, whatever, right? Like, nah, the fact that these people who are foreigners now own tequila ranches means that the people who, indigenous people largely, who would produce crops like or products like tequila or corn or beans or tortillas, et cetera, now they're losing rights to that. So what we've seen in Mexico is that the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer. And when people are no longer able to make it in their home country, that spurs forward immigration. Specifically, it spurs forward undocumented immigration. Now, going back to what I asked here, right? And you consider that capitalism has constantly been moving around what it means to be Mexican, right? And from the very beginning, does a Mexican have to be a Spanish speaker? Does a Mexican have to be Catholic? Does it have to look a certain way? Does it have does it have to come from a certain place, right? And for those of you who are from the United States, specifically for those of you who are from California, remember that all of the US Southwest was once a part of Mexico. So does that mean that I'm a real Mexican if I'm born in the US, if I don't know Spanish, if I'm not a Catholic, right? Now, going back to our student learning outcomes, remember that Mexicanness and indigeneity are interlinked. So the next time that someone says like, oh, you're not a real Mexican or you're whitewashed or whatever, well, now you have something that you can respond with. All right. Well, have a great day, everyone.